So we're on Daf Kuf Zayin, and we're up to Amar Papa, which is 6 lines down from the top. Now, by way of introduction, because it's very confusing, there's a canal and there's a pail of water that's used to take water out of the canal, and then the pail of water, once it's full, is poured into some sort of a ditch, and they irrigated the fields from the water in the ditch. And now the question is, can you fulfill the requirements of Tfilas Yadayim by putting your hands in the water in the ditch? In other words, he's not pouring the water from the pail directly onto his hands. That would be Natilas Yadayim, and that would be valid, assuming that the pail is valid for Natilas Yadayim. It has no holes in it, but here he's not pouring the water. As a matter of fact, Ruvain is pouring the water. Shimon is putting his hands in the ditch after Ruvain had poured the water into the ditch. So Papa says, Haya Risa de Daloi. So in this scenario where there's a canal and water is drawn from the canal with pails poured into dishes, Ein Notlu Mimeni Yadayim. He cannot fulfill the Tfilas Yadayim by putting his hands into the water that's now in the ditch. And why is that? And this is a very important principle. Delo asu mikoach gavra. So this principle called koach gavra is a Shas principle. I believe we had it once in Chullin, and we had it also in Bava Kama. The case in Chullin is where there's a knife and you want to do shchita with the knife, but that requires kol gavra. You have to actually hold the knife and slaughter the animal. But instead, what happened is that you remove a barrier that's holding back water, and once you remove, that barrier, then the water flows and moves the knife. And the question is whether removing the barrier and causing the water to flow is considered kol gavra. Or, for example, let's say this happened in the army a lot when we didn't have access to a cup, and we had to wash our hands for eating. So we opened up the faucet and the water would fall onto our hands directly from the faucet. That's a real issue in the Natilas Yadayim. Is that called kol gavra? Because basically when you open the faucet, you're letting the water come down. But Rav Papa makes the following qualification. He says, even though Ruvain was pouring the water from the pail into the ditch, and therefore when Shimon puts his hands into the water in the ditch, there's no kol gavra on the part of Shimon. The kol gavra is that of Ruvain. However, that's not an absolute rule, meaning if the hands of Shimon are close enough. I'll give an extreme example just to illustrate. Let's say while Ruvain was pouring the water from the canal into the ditch, Shimon would put his hands underneath the pail as Ruvain is pouring the water. That's fine. That's kol gavra. The kol gavra doesn't have to be that of the person who's eating the bread and needs the natila. It could be somebody else. But if the kol gavra is removed, it's remote, because Ruvain is pouring the pail into the ditch here and Shimon is putting his hands into the ditch here, that already breaks the connection between Ruvain's kol gavra and Shimon's natilas yadayim, or call it tfilas yadayim. But says Rav Papa, imekariv legabi davla. Let's say, right, the davla is that utensil, that pail, and if let's say Shimon would put his hands right near the pail, although they're not located exactly under the water that's flowing from the pail, but they're close enough to be considered connected to the Koch Gavra of Ruvain who's pouring the pail, is then notel mimeni yadayim. So then he can fulfill his requirement for eating bread of in the tefillah of Tevilas Yadayim by placing his hands in the ditch, because it's almost like the water is being poured onto his hands. Why? Because there's no distance and it's not remote. His hands are not remotely located vis-a-vis the water in the pail. So up until this point, I'm okay. But the next two lines in the Gemara are very challenging, but we'll give it a try. Ve'i bezia davla bekones mashke. A lot of Aramaic words here. Melif leife umat bilba es hayadayim. Okay, what happens now? We have a very interesting scenario. I'm going to try to illustrate it in words. We really need, an AI illustration here. But what happens is that the pail has a hole on the bottom. And if, let's say, when he puts the pail into the canal, some of the water goes up from the canal into this pail because of the hole on the bottom of the pail. Now he turns the pail over into a ditch, which is, let's call it contiguous or very close to the canal. So if you have the picture in your mind, there are two things going on simultaneously. One is the water from the canal is entering through the hole on the bottom of the pail into the pail. And number two, the water now in the pail is being poured into the canal that's below the pail. It's kind of like if you would imagine, let's say, an arrow going up to an object, and then the arrow goes down this way from that object. So the two arrows sort of connect the water in the canal with the water that's going into the ditch. And that's a principle which is called nitzok in the halacha. Nun yud tzadi vav kuf. And I think we had nitzok in Masechet Avodah Zarah, if I'm not mistaken, with regard to yayin shel akum. And what happens is that the kosher wine is on the bottom, and the non-kosher wine, the yayin shel akum, is on the top in a pail or in a bottle that's being poured into here. And there's what word do I want to use? Unbroken. There's an unbroken vertical flow of water, of wine in that case, in the Gemara of Avodah Zarah, from the Avodah Zarah wine into the kosher wine. And that makes it as if all the wine in the Avodah Zarah wine is inside the kosher wine. That's called nitzok. And the word nitzok basically means a vertical liquid that flows and connects A with B. Oh, so what's melif laif? Again, the Aramaic here is very challenging. The melif laifi is that connection through the mechanism of nitzok, and it connects the water from the canal into the water in the ditch. Now, keep in mind, if he would have put his hands directly into the canal water, there would be no problem, no issue, because that's a real full-fledged mikvah. But the problem is the ditch does not have the status of a mikvah, so we have to somehow connect the water in the ditch to the water in the canal. And the mechanism which allows us to do so, says Rav Papa, is the nitzok, because there's a hole on the bottom of the pail. And since there's a hole on the bottom of the pail, there's water from the canal that is flowing into the pail. Or alternatively, maybe I could say it a little simpler. Maybe I made it too complicated. The water that's going into the pail is also flowing down vertically in a straight line into the canal, which is the mikveh. And therefore, when he pours the water from the pail over into the ditch, it's as if the ditch has the same status as the canal because it's an unbroken flow, and therefore it has the status of a mikveh and matbil ba'as hayadayim. Okay, so basically we got by the roughest part of today's daf. I mean, this daf requires a lot more time than we have on a Friday morning, but at least I think the worst is behind us. Omar Rava, kli shenikav bekones mashke. That same kli that we described, which has a hole on the bottom that's large enough for water to enter into the pail, right, into the pail through that hole on the bottom, that pail itself is now, ein not l'meni yadayim, is disqualified for netilas yadayim. Now watch what's going on here. Until now, we've been talking about tvilas yadayim, which means he puts his hands into the ditch. And the question is whether that ditch has the status of, through nitzok, of the canal from which the water came into the ditch, was drawn into the ditch, or alternatively, whether or not the hands are close enough in proximity to the pail, which is now being poured into the ditch, such that it becomes kol gavra from Ruvain's pouring and Shimon's hands. But now, in Rava's context, we're moving on to netilas yadayim. Netilas yadayim requires a kli, and the Rabbanan established that that kli has to have a shem kli. And when a pail has a hole that's the size of kones mashke, meaning that when you put the pail into the water, let's say you don't even have the top of the pail poured, dug into the water, but just put the pail and the water starts flowing into the pail, that hole is large enough to be mafkia, to invalidate the shem kli, and therefore cannot be used for this ein not l'meni yadayim. Another psak of Rava. We're going to go through a whole list of statements here. Rava says kli she'ein bo revius ein not l'meni yadayim. So the status of a valid kli for netilas yadayim has to have the minimum capacity of holding a revius. How much is a revius? I don't know. Let's say 86 millimeters, whatever it might be. Now, notice that Rav is talking about the size of the kli. You follow me? What's the volume capacity of the kli? He's not talking about how much water actually was poured onto the hands. So nowhere does Rav say at this point that the actual netila requires a revius. Just the kli for netila requires a revius. The Gemara raises the following objection. 80 is the sofa. Amar Rava. Rava seems to contradict himself because it says kli she'ein machzik revius ein not l'mimenu liyadayim ha-machzik afal gav de lespe. Meaning, it doesn't seem like, according to Rava, let's take the two statements of Rava and compare and contrast them. The first statement of Rava seems to indicate that maybe you need a revius in the kli, but the second statement of Rava is whether or not the kli is machzik revius. And if it's not machzik, if it doesn't have the capacity for a revius, then it's disqualified for netilas yadayim. But it doesn't mean that there has to be a revius now in the kli according to Rava's second statement, that's being poured on the hands. Lo kasha. Now here the Gemara comes up with a very radical idea, at least for me, it's something brand new, and that is something called shirayim, but not shirayim from the Rebbe, but rather shirayim from Ruvain, who put a revius into the kli. Then he used the kli to pour onto his hands for Netilas Yadayim. Ruvain's about to eat bread. Shimon comes along, and there's still some water left in the kli. It's less than a revius. So the Gemara is now saying that you have to have a capacity revius if there's one person and he's doing the Netilas Yadayim for the bread he's about to eat, and he pours a revius onto his hands. But if there's Ruvain and Shimon, Shimon doesn't have to actually pour a revius onto his hands, as long as there's some residue left over shirayim of mayim that was used for Ruvain, then Shimon could take that kli with, let's start Lamazog half a revius in it, and he could use that for Netilas Yadayim. In other words, once we have two things, we could check off two requirements. Number one, the kli itself has a revius. Number two, the revius was designated and used for Netilas Yadayim, but not all of the revius. Then the mayim that's left over in the kli as shirayim of Ruvain's netila now has the status of mayim for Netilas Yadayim. And that's the Gemara's language over here. The Gemara says that halachad, right? If there's only one person washing his hands, then you need the revius. But halatrei, if Shimon is in the on-deck circle and Ruvain is hitting the ball and now he's pouring the revius onto his hands, then the leftover mayim in the kli after Ruvain's done with his netila, despite the fact that it's not a revius, can be used by Shimon for his netilas asnan, as we learn in a Mishnah in Maseches, you guessed it, Yadayim. May revius notlin liyadayim liechad. Right? If there's only one person, you need a full revius. But once you have the full revius, and afilu l'shnayim, that same revius could kill two birds with one stone, meaning it could be valid for Ruvain and for Shimon. It's almost like Ruvain and Shimon are shutfim, their partners in that revius, and both of them will be able to fulfill their requirement for the Netilas Yadayim. Amalei Rav Sheshes Liam Meimar. Again, the names are not so critical, because really what Rav Sheshes was talking to a Meimar about was exactly what Rava was discussing. And he says the following. Okay, so now Rav Sheshes is interrogating a Meimar. He wants to know how a Meimar rules halach l'maisa and Netilas Yadayim. And he asked him a whole series of questions. First of all, kapdisu amona, are you makbid to get a vessel that has the same kli and fulfills all the requirements of a kli in order to do Netilas Yadayim? Amalei, yes. Achazu. So what happens if some wine would fall into water and the water now changes its color? Are you allowed to use that for Netilas Yadayim? Amalei, I'm very makbid about that. It's got to have the appearance of water. Third question, ashiura. Are you very careful that the water that's being used for Netilas Yadayim has the minimum shear of a revius? Yes. However, now the Gemara is a Lishna Basra, another transmission of the response of Meimar to the question of Rav Sheshes. Amana b'chazusa kaptinan. We are makpid that there be a vessel which has the same kli, and that the water look like water and not discolored. However, ashira lo makabdina. Meaning, there is a way of having the Netilas Yadayim without a revius being poured on your hands, as long as the kli has a revius, right? Then it's a kli. The water looks like water, appears like water. And now Ruvain is going to wash his hands with that revius, and Shimon is going to wash his hands from the same revius. So in effect, what the Ikadiamri is arguing that Mema really responded to Rav Sheshes that you don't need an actual revius of yayin of mayim, excuse me, to wash your hands. But the Gemara rejects it. Velohi. Memar jumped the gun. That's called velohi. He made a jump, a leap of faith, and he equated two different scenarios. And the Gemara differentiates between them fundamentally. One scenario is whether or not you need a revius mayim for Natila, and the other is whether or not Shimon could use the residue of mayim. Don't confuse the two, because the Gemara is saying that shiny hasam, the only time that you could have such a thing as a Natilas Yadayim that's valid without a revius going on your hands, that's only mishum deka'asum mishiori tahara. That's only because it was leftover residue water from the water that was used and designated for Natilas Yadayim by Ruvain, and now we're using it for Shimon. Askin Rav Yaakov minahar pkod natla bar revius. So this I found a little bit interesting, that the various Amoraim, people would come to them and ask them, well, I don't know exactly how much a revius is. Is this a revius? Does this hold a revius or a smaller cup? So what they would do is they obtained a revius cup that held exactly a revius, and then when people would ask them their questions, they would compare what their question was to that, standard cup that held a revius. Or, for example, the Gemara says about Rav Ashi that asking Rav Ashi b'hutzel kuza bas revia. Okay, so he also wanted to measure the size of the Natilas Yadayim cups, and he designated an earthenware jug in a place called Hutzal, and that earthenware jug had a revius, and now anytime they would bring in a kli, they would compare its. This reminds me a little bit of Piaget. Did you ever hear Piaget? He was a Swiss psychologist. So I could show you two cups, and I'll ask you which cup holds more, and the eye plays tricks on you. You think, oh, this is larger than that, but then you pour it one until you see that. All right, anyway. Omar Rav, another statement of Rav with regard to Natilas Yadayim, and this is a little bit challenging. He says, Magufas chavis. Okay, what's Magufas chavis? In those days, almost all liquids, like for example, wine, were in barrels, and they would plaster like an earthenware kind of cover onto the barrel. That's called magufas chavis. Now, the magufa itself, generally speaking, is flat, so it can't serve as a receptacle for liquids. So there's no way under the sun that you could do natilas yadayim with a magufas chavis. However, shetikna, what did he do with it? He apparently, I'm not sure exactly whether he dug it out or maybe he pressed it with weight, and somehow he turned this magufa into a receptacle, such that now he could pour a revius of mayim, and now he wants to use that magufa with a revius of mayim into it for natilas yadayim, is notlim many yadayim. So again, the fact that initially its designation was not as a receptacle as a kli kibul, because it was only a magufa to cover, flat magufa covering to cover the barrel of wine, that's irrelevant. What's only relevant is now, and if he makes the proper changes, or we'll call them modifications, such that now that magufa has a receptacle, he could use it for natilas yadayim. He quotes here, Rashi is saying he carves a hole on the underside of the cover of the barrel. And now, as a result of that carving of a hole, it holds a revius. Okay, fine. Tanya Nami Hochi, the Gemara wants to support Rava's ruling with a brisa. Megufas chavish shetikna notlim mimenu liyadayim. And now we have a similar halacha, which is called chemas. Okay, what's a chemas? Chemas is even in biblical Hebrew, I believe it's like a flask made out of the skin of an animal. Ukfisha. Okay, what's exactly a kfisha? That I don't know. Let's see if he by chance tells me what a kfisha is. All right, it's another type of a skin bottle. Is not lemehem liyadayim. Fine. Why not? I mean, even if it's made of an animal's skin or hide, but why can't you use it for Natil Yadayim? It has the same kli. Oh, but here we have a problem. Sak v'kupa afal pisha mekablim ain't notlim imem yadayim. A sack or a wicker basket cannot be used for Natil Yadayim, even though it is a receptacle. So what's the problem with this sack? It seems that the sack sort of is very soft and pliable, and it kind of collapses. You know, you could easily flatten it out. So it's not sturdy. But what did he do? He tried to use it to modify it in such a way that it would now hold liquids, and he smeared tar around them. Now, how is this different than the other cases that we had? See, all I could tell you is the following. In these last two cases of Sak and Kupa, they are designated for solids and not for liquids. Like, let's imagine a sackcloth. So you put your laundry in there, whatever you do. Or, for example, you have a basket. So I can show you here in my kitchen, we have a bunch of old baskets and, wicker baskets and so forth and so on. And, you could put all sorts of vegetables in them, fruits, whatever you want to transport, but it's not made for liquids. And now the Gemara is adding another element here that in order to qualify as a receptacle for Natilas Yadayim, the Shem Kli is not sufficient. It's got to be a Kli that's designated for liquids. And even though when he tars the inside of the basket, it can now hold the liquid in the fold, but that's not what it's designated for. It's not a Kli for noselim, for water, and therefore it's not kosher for Natilas Yadayim. All right, Iboilu, the Gemara has a suffix. Ma'u lecho b'mapa. Do I have to do Natilas Yadayim if I'm not going to come in contact? My hands will not touch the food because I'm wearing gloves. Should we think that maybe the glove will fall off and so forth and so on, and it will come in contact with the bread, so therefore we require Natilas Yadayim? Oh, he's wearing gloves, and we can assume that his only contact with the food will be with the gloves, so he won't have direct contact between his skin of the hands and the food, Toshma. And we have now a Mishnah in Maseches Sukkah. Okay, now as you know, the Gemara very often tells us that when they saw them from the Gedolim doing what they did, they learned, they derived conclusions. So now we're talking about Rabbi Tzadok. Shenasnu lo Rabbi Tzadok ochel pachos mikebetza notlo b'mapa v'ochlo chutz l'sukkah. Now, at this point, when I translate the words, it would seem that the Gemara is quoting a Mishnah in Sukkah to prove that covering your hands would be sufficient and circumvent the requirement of Netilas Yadayim. But it's actually the opposite. Why? Because Rabbi Tzadok had an equation, or shall we call it an interdependence, between Netilas Yadayim and Birkas HaMazon. Again, that requires a lot of deep analysis, why there should be such a tlut, an interdependence. Now, we're talking about pachos mikebetza. And according to the Shita Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Meir, this is a Masechta Brachos, if you're only eating a kibetza's worth of bread, then you don't recite Birkas HaMazon. I'm sorry, let me say that again. Cross that out. If you only eat an olive-size bread, but not a kibetza, then you're not chayiv in Birkas HaMazon. Because the Torah says, v'achalta v'savata. And tzviya is only a kibetza, not an olive size. You don't feel satiated with an olive size. So the fact that Rav Tzadok would cover his hands and eat pachos mikebetza without having to wash, because he covered his hands, is going to prove to us pugfaket, just the opposite conclusion. Meaning, had he eaten a kibetza, then covering his hands wouldn't have done a thing. He would have still required Netilas Yadayim. Notlo b'mapa v'ochel chutz l'sukkah. Now there's another halacha that you're allowed to have a what's called an achilas haroy outside the sukkah, like a snack. And he held that if it's less than a kibetza, you're allowed to eat it outside the sukkah. Fine. That's how it comes into sukkah. Since he didn't eat a full kibetza, therefore Tzadok would not bench after he ate less than a kibetza of bread. My love, shouldn't we be medayik that kibetza, had he eaten a full egg volume, then boy Netilas Yadayim, even though he's covering his hands. So you see that covering your hands does not obviate the need for Netilas Yadayim. So Gemara says no. Dilma ha kibetza boy sukkah boy bracha. Maybe the subject and the focal point of this discussion in the Mishnah in Sukkah is number one, Birkas HaMazon, number two, Sukkah, and that's what they're saying, that he's not chayiv in Sukkah because he ate less than a kibetza. He's not chayiv in Birkas HaMazon because we're holding like Rabbi Yehuda, and there's no v'savatim less than a kibetza. But this has no implication as far as Netilas Yadayim is concerned. It could be Netilas Yadayim he would not have required if he covers his hands, even if he ate a full kibetza. Tashma. So let's try a different proof. Shmuel noticed that Rav was eating bread without washing because he took it in a cloth. He never had direct contact between his hands and the bread. Amalei Shmuel said to him,